Hey friends, welcome. Tonight, we begin with a real medieval village wedding, not the royal version, but the muddy, noisy, cabbage-scented kind. Where the vows were sacred, the guests were drunk, and someone's goat always wandered into the ceremony. Before we begin, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy calm, immersive storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far this little village reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum. And let us step into a world of whispers, firelight, and flower crowns trampled under dancing feet. Let us begin. There was no official announcement, no parchment sealed with wax, and certainly no trumpet to mark the occasion. Just a whisper, passed from one crooked mouth to another over buckets of cold well water and bread baked that morning with more hope than flour. Did you hear? Elsbeth's youngest is finally getting married. That was all it took. One sentence. Maybe two. And by the end of the day, the entire village knew, from the toothless shepherd mumbling to his goats to the midwife who had not delivered a child in 3 winters but still remembered everyone's birth weight. Even the chickens seemed to cluck with unusual excitement, though that might have just been the wind. In a medieval village, news did not spread by letter. It spread by proximity, repetition, and a remarkable ability to fill silences with speculation. You did not overhear the news so much as absorb it, like smoke from a peat fire, steady, uninvited, and impossible to avoid. There were no calendars nailed to wooden walls. No printed invites. But somehow, everyone still found their way to the same muddy patch of grass at more or less the right time, as if drawn by some invisible rope of curiosity, habit, or the faint promise of free ale. It began with the old women. Always the old women. Not because they were nosy, though they absolutely were, but because they had mastered the art of conversational archaeology. One sideways glance, one shift in a young girl's gait, and they could excavate entire betrothals. He has been lingering too long by her family's onion patch. One would murmur. That boy is up to something. And she would be right, because the village matriarchs were rarely wrong and never silent. They wielded gossip like other people wielded spades, digging, planting, unearthing, and occasionally clubbing someone with it. The men, for their part, pretended not to care. They grunted and muttered about harvests and pigs and the price of salt, but the moment someone mentioned a wedding, their ears twitched. Not from sentiment, that was too soft, but from calculation. Weddings meant gatherings. Gatherings meant ale. Ale meant stories. And if you were lucky, maybe even a fistfight or a game of who can fall asleep nearest the fire without catching on fire. The men were ready. They just did not want to look eager. Children, of course, caught the news in their own way. They were not told, but they knew. Maybe from the way their parents started muttering more, or how their older siblings brushed their hair for the first time in weeks. Something was happening, and it probably involved cake. Or mud. Or both. So they ran faster, shouted louder, and practiced tumbling into haystacks for no reason at all, just in case it became relevant. Even the animals noticed. The village dog, a scruffy mutt with 3 good legs and no known name, began hovering closer to the baker's door. The pigs wallowed near the meeting tree with a suspicious amount of interest. Livestock may not have understood the sanctity of vows, but they understood leftovers, and weddings, if nothing else, were good for scraps. But the most fascinating part of the whisper chain was not the gossip. It was the build-up. Once the rumor took hold, people began watching each other. Who smiled at whom, who offered to help with firewood, who lingered at the well after dark. A cough from the miller's daughter became a mystery. Was she ill? Nervous? Pregnant? All equally possible, and all equally likely to be discussed before sunrise. Suspicion was a form of affection in the village. If no one speculated about your personal life, you were not interesting enough. And in this fog of guesses and glances, one truth eventually crystallized. There was going to be a wedding. Someone was going to say words in front of other people and be considered legally, spiritually, and socially fused. Not because they were deeply in love, though that sometimes happened, but because someone needed someone else's goat, or land, or cousin. Romance was optional. Proximity, however, was unavoidable. Once certainty replaced rumor, things shifted. The bride-to-be began walking differently, not because she was nervous, but because her mother made her wear shoes. The groom stood up straighter, partly out of pride, partly because everyone suddenly noticed his posture. Families began cleaning, which mostly meant sweeping dirt from one side of the hut to the other, and telling children not to lick the wall. There were no rehearsals, no dress fittings, no florists. But there was tension, the kind of low, buzzing anticipation that made the cows restless and the bread rise just a bit too fast. Everyone waited. Before there was a wedding, before the stew was stirred or the ale was brewed, there was the bargain. The betrothal, formal or informal, whispered or declared with ceremonial gravity, was the invisible root of the wedding tree, and like many roots, it was knotted, unpredictable, and occasionally dragged in a chicken. It began in muddy fields, beside creaking fences, or at the hearth after a long day's toil. Unlike the church-bound ceremony that followed, betrothal belonged to the realm of family, of strategy, of carefully measured compromise. It was less poetry, more produce. Medieval peasants did not often marry for love. They married for land, labor, goats, and the faint hope of surviving one more winter with someone who did not snore loudly enough to summon wolves. Affection could come later sometimes. But first came negotiations. Not between lovers, but between families. And not romantic negotiations, but practical ones. Marriage was not a fairy tale. It was a transaction with mud on its boots and hay in its teeth. It usually started with a conversation between fathers. Or sometimes a mother if she was the more feared negotiator, and she often was. These talks did not happen at formal tables or over quills and ink. They happened during hay stacking, turnip sorting, or at the edge of a pig pen. The setting did not matter. What mattered was what could be offered. Your boy has a strong back. My daughter has a patch of decent soil and a cow that mostly behaves. Shall we talk? These were not flattering exchanges. No one swooned. But they were honest, measured, and rich in subtext. Dowries were the cornerstone of the betrothal bargain. Not just money, which was rare and hoarded like dragon gold, but goods. Livestock, tools, wool, cheese, ale, blankets, and promises. A good dowry did not mean wealth, it meant readiness. It showed that a family could part with something valuable, that they were willing to support the new household being born. And if you were lucky, the dowry included something fancy, like a pot without cracks or a goose that was not actively cursed. Families that offered well in turn secured their social footing. A generous dowry could erase a weak roof or a history of bad barley. But the dowry was only one side. There was also the bride price, a term that sounds harsher than it was. This was the groom's family's contribution, a kind of acknowledgement that a daughter was not simply given away like a spare turnip. She was labor, future children, social standing, and often the only literate person in the household. The bride price might be a sack of grain, a pair of boots, or an agreement to help thatch a roof next spring. Symbolic, but powerful. It showed commitment and capability. And it was a subtle way of saying, "We know her worth, and we will honor it." The betrothal bargain was not sealed with rings. It was sealed with handshakes, nods, spit, or whatever symbol the village accepted. In some places, hands were joined over bread. In others, the groom handed over a small coin, not for its value, but for its ritual meaning. In many villages, simply declaring intentions in front of witnesses was enough. "He will take her," the father might say, "if the gods and the cows agree." Sometimes, the priest was invited to bless the arrangement, though often he arrived late or not at all, especially if he was also the only blacksmith. Young people often had little say, though not none. A girl could protest, especially if the proposed groom had poor hygiene or an unpleasant reputation. And while parents could push, the church increasingly required consent. That did not always mean heartfelt agreement. Sometimes it meant a long silence followed by a reluctant nod and a glance that said, "Fine, but I am naming our first child after a better option." Occasionally, the bride-to-be would escape to a relative's cottage to delay things. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes she returned to find the goat had already been gifted in her name. Secret betrothals did happen. Two young lovers might swear themselves to each other under a tree, witnessed only by the moon and a sheep with trust issues. These unions, while frowned upon, were hard to undo if spoken aloud and heard by others. Words had weight. In a world without many written contracts, your voice was your bond. And if you told someone you were theirs, that declaration echoed like a bell in a valley. These secret promises were often the stuff of village lore, later sung as tragic ballads or told as cautionary tales. Sometimes a betrothal was more dramatic. If a boy lacked goods or family standing, he might offer service instead. A year of labor. Help with harvest. A pig raised from birth to wedding day. And if the girl's parents were unsure, the suitor could offer the ultimate pledge, to build a hut. A roof, for walls, a hearth. Proof that he could house her, warm her, and keep the goats mostly outside. In some rare cases, the hut was built first and remained empty until the wedding. Villagers would nod solemnly each time they passed it, noting that readiness, even without love, was a virtue. Villages watched these bargains with quiet intensity. Not just out of curiosity, but out of social investment. A marriage meant the beginning of a new economic unit. More hands in the field. More mouths to feed, yes, but also more stories, more drama, more shared tasks. Everyone had a stake. Even if that stake was just wanting to be the first to whisper. They are engaged. I knew it. Bets were placed. Ale was wagered. Uncles suddenly remembered they had useful advice. If an agreement was reached, there might be a small feast. Nothing extravagant. Maybe a round loaf of bread, a jug passed between families, a dance if someone brought a flute. This was not the wedding. This was the prelude. But it mattered. It gave shape to the future. It allowed people to imagine the union, to start referring to the couple as if the vows were already said. His future wife, they would say. Her almost husband. These names carried a strange tenderness, even among the skeptical. Children noticed. Boys would nudge each other and grin. Girls would whisper and pretend not to be excited. Betrothal made things real. The boy you threw rocks at last year was now the boy you would share a roof with. The girl who once stomped on your flower crown might be your wife. It was strange. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. They watched the adults with wide eyes, trying to understand the gravity of bread shared between families. And so the betrothal bargain became its own kind of folklore. It was told and retold. Years later, the story of who offered what and how many chickens changed hands would be exaggerated and embroidered. He promised her 10 goats. It was 3, and 1 was blind. Truth mattered less than memory. The couple would grow old under the shadow of that bargain. And every anniversary, someone would raise a mug and toast. To the goose who sealed the deal! And the goose, if still alive, would honk in reluctant agreement. There were missteps, of course. Promises broken. Families who reneged. Sometimes the dowry never arrived. Sometimes the groom vanished with someone else's pig. These betrayals were rare but memorable. They left emotional craters, reshaped alliances, and inspired at least one angry song that was still hummed 2 villages over. To be jilted was a social wound. To jilt, a daring act that carried consequences. This was the beginning. Not the ceremony. Not the feast. But the choosing. The planning. The quiet contracts that tied one family to another. And like all things in the village, it was messy, heartfelt, practical, and a little bit magical. Because behind every muddy handshake, every muttered promise, every gift of slightly lopsided cheese, was the start of something brave, the decision to bind 2 lives together, and hope for the best. Hope that the pig would behave. That the cow would milk. That the winters would not be too cruel. And above all, that the bargain, once made, would hold fast against the wind, the rain, and the judgmental looks of every neighbor who had something to say. In the medieval village, no one ever received a written invitation to a wedding. There were no folded parchments pressed with wax seals, no calligraphy, no formal RSVP deadlines written in ink. Stationery was a myth. The only script most people saw came from the sky, in the shape of ravens, or the strange way clouds twisted before rain. Yet, somehow, everyone knew. Everyone always knew. The moment a betrothal was settled, bread broken, hands shaken, a goat vaguely promised, the social machinery of the village clicked into place. Word spread with startling efficiency, not through intention, but through nature. A muttered comment while drawing water at the well. A teasing remark shared at the mill. an offhand joke flung across a field. Each utterance added momentum, and soon, the entire community operated with a shared understanding: there was going to be a wedding. Not because they were invited, but because how could they not be? The village gossip network, though invisible, was ruthlessly effective. Old women, with voices softer than a breeze but sharper than a scythe, passed along the news with precision. Children, pretending not to listen, absorbed everything and repeated it with theatrical flair. Men shared news through metaphors and shoulder shrugs, not because they were secretive, but because saying things plainly was too vulnerable. And by the time the couple themselves had announced it, if they ever did, the story had already completed its rounds, gathered embellishments, and become a collective property. Attendance at a wedding was not about formality. It was about belonging. If you lived within shouting distance of the village tree, if you had once shared a stew pot with the bride's uncle, or helped the groom haul hay during last year's thunderstorm, you were expected to come. Not expected like a duty, expected like a law of nature. The village flowed towards celebration the way water finds a slope. Refusal to show up was a kind of statement, and not a polite one. There were no guest lists. No seat assignments. No worries about dietary restrictions or plus ones. The idea that someone needed permission to witness a union between two people who had grown up beside their hedgerows was laughable. The ceremony was communal, not curated. Everyone who heard about the wedding was, in essence, invited. And anyone who did not hear about it likely lived under a rock. Even then, someone probably scratched a message into the rock. Yet, even without a formal system, there was a strange order to the chaos. The baker knew she was expected to bring bread. The brewer prepared his best barrels, whether or not anyone specifically asked. The cobbler might throw together a pair of mismatched but passable shoes for the bride. And neighbors appeared with wrapped bundles, half-stitched cloth, a painted ladle, a wheel of cheese that had been aging since the last wedding. No one was assigned a role, yet everyone had one. News even traveled to nearby villages, depending on the family's connections or the intensity of the gossip. A cousin from a mile downriver might arrive unannounced, bearing a questionable meat pie and an even more questionable friend. No one turned them away. Weddings were porous by design. It did not matter where you came from, so long as you came hungry and brought a story. Sometimes, guests arrived not knowing who exactly was getting married. They had heard there was a gathering, and that was enough. These wanderers lingered at the edges, nodding politely, laughing too loudly, and helping themselves to turnips with the confidence of family. And truly, in a way, they were family. Weddings dissolved the sharp lines between kin and neighbor, stranger and friend. Everyone blurred into one joyful, chaotic mass. If you asked a medieval villager who invited them to the wedding, they might blink in confusion. "It is a wedding," they would say, as if that explained everything. And it did. The act of marriage, of public union, pulled people together in a way no parchment ever could. No invite could match the lure of roasted onions, the promise of fresh bread, or the possibility of dancing terribly but without judgment. Children were the best informants. They ran from door to door, breathless with updates. "The groom has shaved. They are hanging wildflowers near the well." Their excitement was a fuel source, propelling preparations forward. Some were sent ahead to claim spots. Others scouted for which house had started stewing meat, hoping to steal a taste. They did not need formal roles. Mischief was their invitation. Animals, too, became accidental guests. Dogs slinked through the crowd, drawn by the smell of salted fat. Chickens wandered too close and became part of the decorations. A goat, belonging to no one and everyone, always found its way into the festivities. No one stopped them. A village wedding was not a place for fences. Of course, not every guest was welcome in spirit. There were those whose arrival elicited tight-lipped smiles and knowing glances. The cousin who drank too much and flirted with everyone. The widow who recited long tales of her own wedding, which happened 40 years ago, involved 3 goats, and ended with a thunderstorm. Still, they were part of the patchwork. A wedding without a few awkward guests was like bread without salt, passable, but missing flavor. Some villagers dressed up for the occasion. Not in new clothes, no one had new clothes, but in their least mended, least dusty versions. A child might wear a flower crown made from wilted dandelions. A woman might find a ribbon that had not been chewed by mice. The point was not fashion. It was effort. It was showing up with dignity, however humble. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the paths around the village were trampled into wider roads. You could tell something was about to happen simply by the earth itself. Foot traffic etched intention into soil. Fires burned longer into the evening. Laughter erupted more frequently. Someone tuned a fiddle out of earshot. The village became a single lung, inhaling the promise of celebration. No parchment could contain that. No wax seal could replicate the pull of shared memory and mutual curiosity. The medieval wedding was not a private affair. It was a social tide, pulling everyone in, swirling them through joy and awkward hugs and off-key singing. So yes, there were no invitations. But everyone was invited. And if you happened to pass through the village on that day, wearing your traveling cloak and looking vaguely hungry, someone would likely press a mug into your hand, point toward the laughter, and say, "Come! There is a wedding. You might as well dance." In the medieval world, fashion did not operate on trends or seasons. It operated on availability, climate, superstition, and whether or not the goat had chewed through your last clean sleeve. So when a wedding was announced, not with invitations but with general buzz and an uptick in communal sweeping, the question was not, "What will I wear?" It was, "Is there anything not currently in use as a rag, curtain, or goat bandage?" There were no tailors on standby, no fashion consultants, no frantic trips to market for matching accessories. A peasant wedding wardrobe was a balancing act between hope and compromise. Hope that something passable remained in the chest under the bed. Compromise when you realized it did not. For most villagers, their best clothes were also there. Only clothes, just temporarily less filthy. Wedding preparation often involved more scrubbing than sewing. Tunics were dunked in buckets, beaten on rocks, hung near fires, and prayed over. If the stain came out, it was a miracle. If it did not, it became part of the outfit's story. That brown patch! That is from the cabbage stew incident of '82. The hierarchy of dress was subtle but observed. The bride, naturally, had priority. Her attire might include a linen shift, if the family was prosperous, or a woolen one, if they were not. Either way, it would be the cleanest garment in the village that day. She might wear a belt woven by her grandmother, or a ribbon saved since childhood. If she owned shoes, they would be worn, regardless of comfort. If she did not, flowers would be braided around her ankles as a poetic substitute. Color carried meaning, though not always deliberately. White was rare, not because of its symbolism, but because it was impractical and almost impossible to maintain in a place where mud was considered a permanent season. More common were earth tones, softened from years of wear, and accidental patchwork, pieces stitched from whatever was available, which gave the bride a kind of rustic mosaic elegance. Blue, if present, suggested prosperity. Green suggested courage. Red suggested someone had spilled beetroot the day before. Groom attire was simpler. He wore what he could. Often a tunic, cinched at the waist with rope or a worn leather belt. If he owned a cloak, he wore it, even in summer, just to look important. He might borrow boots from a cousin with smaller feet and walk stiffly all day to maintain the illusion of fit. A flower tucked behind his ear, courtesy of a sibling or friend, served as a nod to ceremony. Personal grooming was expected but not enforced. A combed beard, a washed face, and a fleeting scent of herbs counted as extravagance. Headwear was a prized detail. For brides, floral crowns made from wild blooms, herbs, and occasionally feathers were the pinnacle of wedding elegance. Children were often enlisted to help collect materials, sometimes with more enthusiasm than skill. A crown might include daisies, thyme, and a particularly proud dandelion that refused to sit flat. Veils, if they existed at all, were simple cloths pinned delicately, often shifting in the wind like shy flags. The guests, meanwhile, arrived in whatever combination of clothing had not been claimed by mildew or livestock. Shawls were borrowed and returned months later, if ever. Aprons were scrubbed and hung around necks like capes. Jewelry, for those who owned any, was worn proudly, twisted bits of tin, carved bone, or the occasional bead strung on twine. Everything had meaning. A chipped brooch might have belonged to a grandmother who once danced at her own wedding in the same clearing. Children were dressed with optimism and futility. Their clothing, hastily patched and often mismatched, was selected more for durability than appearance. But no one minded. Their energy was part of the decor. A child in a too-big tunic running through mud was a medieval tradition unto itself. Even animals were occasionally adorned. Someone, often a tipsy uncle, would tie flowers to the horns of a goat or plait straw into the mane of a patient donkey. Chickens clucked indignantly as children attempted to fit them with crowns of grass. These efforts were rarely successful, but they reflected a communal desire to make everything, even beasts, a little more festive. Clothing served more than vanity. It was symbolic. To dress for a wedding was to say, "This matters." It was a gesture of respect, a celebration of survival, and an acknowledgement that beauty, even in small, worn pieces, deserved to be seen. A man with holes in his sleeves might arrive with clean fingernails and a sprig of lavender tucked behind his ear. That was enough. There were mishaps, of course. A belt would snap mid-dance. A sleeve would tear during a toast. Someone's best tunic would become the casualty of an overzealous stew ladle. But these failures were part of the joy. The laughter that followed a wardrobe disaster was deeper, more honest, and echoed longer than any sermon. There was, however, one universally understood rule: do not outshine the bride. Not intentionally. Not accidentally. Not by accident of color, ornament, or proximity to the cider barrel. Anyone who risked drawing more eyes than the bride, even if only because their shirt was new, was met with raised eyebrows and thin smiles. It was not envy. It was etiquette. As the ceremony approached, the village looked transformed. Not because of garlands or ribbons, but because of the people. For once, everyone wore their pride. They stood straighter. They dusted off not just their sleeves, but their dignity. And they looked at each other not as neighbors bound by routine, but as a community capable of celebration. No one wore silk. No one glimmered in jewels. But the beauty was undeniable. It shimmered in the sunlit folds of a clean tunic, in the awkward placement of a wildflower, in the smile of someone who had not smiled in months. This was medieval fashion at its finest, honest, humble, and utterly human. So when the bride stepped forward, garlanded in wild color and layered with memory, there was no need for trumpets. The people cheered. The wind lifted her veil. And somewhere, unnoticed but deeply felt, the earth itself approved. And so the village, patched and proud, clothed in its collective best, stood ready to witness something beautiful. Not because they were dressed for it, but because they had chosen to be part of it. And that choice, messy, heartfelt, and lovingly frayed, was always the finest thing anyone could wear. In medieval times, a wedding was sacred not because of its setting, but in spite of it. There were no manicured gardens or echoing cathedrals with candlelit aisles for peasants. No violin quartets rehearsing in vaulted arches. Instead, there was dirt, grass, dung, sky, and the unwavering belief that a vow made in the open air, with muddy boots and breathless goats, still counted before God. The setting of a peasant wedding was determined less by aesthetic and more by geography and weather. The most common ceremony site? The churchyard. Not the inside, mind you, that was reserved for holy sacraments, funerals, and the occasional fox chasing a hen mid-sermon. Weddings, particularly among the lower classes, were often held just outside, in the patch of earth where the priest could project his voice without echo and the villagers could cluster without knocking over relics. There was a charm to it, really. The church stood as a backdrop, mossy and slightly tilted, flanked by crumbling stones and an overgrown hedge or two. Gravestones doubled as benches. A low wall kept out some of the livestock and none of the wind. If it rained, cloaks were pulled tighter, and the priest simply spoke louder. Rain was not a deterrent, it was a participant. If the churchyard was not available, perhaps in use for a burial, or if the priest was late, again, the ceremony might take place in a clearing, a field, or the main path through the village. Any space where a crowd could gather without immediately trampling cabbages. The altar might be a tree stump, a cart turned sideways, or a flat rock deemed holy enough. It was not about grandeur. It was about gathering. Cows were not uncommon guests. Neither were chickens, goats, or the occasional confused pig. Animals were not decor, they were neighbors. They grazed nearby, observed with great interest, and sometimes objected loudly at the wrong moment. If the couple vowed eternal love just as a donkey let loose a celebratory bray, well, it simply made the memory more vivid. Paths were lined with nothing but expectation. Some families laid fresh straw for the bride to walk on, a symbolic gesture of care and cleanliness. Others threw herbs into the air, rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom, lavender for not smelling like turnip stew. Children scattered petals, real or imagined, while older villagers muttered blessings under their breath. The crowd formed its own boundaries. There were no ropes, no signs, no ushers. People stood where they could see and hear. Elders edged toward the front for better view and the illusion of importance. The young lingered in the back, giggling, elbowing, watching everything with exaggerated disinterest. Strangers drifted in and were absorbed like rain into soil. The priest, if present, arrived with a hurried gait and an expression that suggested he had been milking a cow until 5 minutes ago. He would pull forth a book, dog-eared, damp, possibly missing entire chapters, and clear his throat with ceremony. No microphone. Just lung power and the judgment of the heavens. He recited the words from memory or improvised with holy confidence. The villagers did not mind. As long as he mentioned God and did not sneeze directly onto the chalice, the ritual was sound. Some ceremonies were staggeringly brief. A few muttered prayers, a pair of "I do" equivalents, and a sign of the cross, all done before the dog finished scratching itself. Others took longer, particularly if the priest enjoyed the spotlight, or if the families had conflicting ideas about what counted as a completed vow. There were disagreements mid-ceremony. That was normal. The ceremony paused, people argued quietly or loudly, and then it resumed, slightly reshuffled and no less blessed. Sometimes couples spoke their own vows. Not flowery speeches, but simple declarations. "I take you to share my roof, my meals, and my winters." These statements were honest and often moving. There were no metaphors. Just truth, spoken plainly in the presence of neighbors, livestock, and eternity. Distractions were expected. A child might wail. A chicken might escape someone's grip and scurry through the proceedings like a feathery omen. Someone would cough with the theatricality of a dying bard. These interruptions were not sins. They were seasoning. They reminded everyone that this was a human ritual, not a staged performance. The couple stood, hand in hand, on the same earth they had tilled, stumbled on, danced across during harvest. There was power in that. They did not need a palace or choir to make their union real. They needed each other, a few witnesses, and the stubborn will to promise something permanent in a world that rarely offered guarantees. If a ring was exchanged, it was often a simple band of iron, perhaps bent into shape by the groom or his cousin. Sometimes it was string, or a token passed between hands. Rings were symbols, not requirements. The true binding was in the act of speaking before others. In being known. In choosing. After the vows, there might be a cheer, a prayer, or both. Someone would produce ale, as if by magic. The goat might be led away ceremoniously, which was mostly just someone tugging it with one hand while balancing bread in the other. Children would start dancing without music. And just like that, the sacred flowed into the celebratory. The ceremony gave way to the feast. What mattered was not the setting. It was the witnessing. The field could be muddy. The altar could be a wheelbarrow. But if the village was watching, and the couple was willing, the marriage was real. That was the heart of it. Not the stones or the setting, but the shared agreement, this matters. We see it. We stand for it. So whether beneath a leaning steeple or beside a grazing ox, with wind in their hair and clods of soil beneath their feet, two people made a promise. And everyone, from the priest to the piglet, became part of something larger than themselves, a ceremony not just of love, but of belonging. The ceremony itself was the heart of the wedding, the moment where all the anticipation, gossip, borrowed cloaks, and strategically hidden ale flasks culminated in a few breathless words. But unlike the lengthy, tear-soaked declarations found in courtly poems or modern dramas, the medieval peasant wedding ceremony was swift, sacred, and woven with the sounds of livestock. There were no rehearsals. No seating charts. No flower girls shepherded down an aisle with sugared bribes. What happened during the ceremony was a delicate balance between tradition and survival. Say the holy words, exchange a token, if you had one, and do it all before the weather changed or someone's goat got loose. It began with the gathering, informal, uneven, and deeply personal. Friends, family, neighbors, and wanderers formed a ring around the couple. There was no aisle, but there was a kind of deference. The bride and groom would step into the center of the crowd, and people instinctively shifted to make space, like the earth itself was leaning back to watch. The priest, if he was present and reasonably sober, would step forward with the confidence of someone who had conducted funerals in storms and baptisms during bandit raids. His robes might be patched, his sandals muddy, but his voice rang out with the kind of authority born from necessity. He held a book, possibly missing some pages, and recited prayers that blurred Latin and local dialects. Most villagers did not understand the words, but they recognized the rhythm, and that was enough. The couple stood quietly, hands clasped or just brushing, depending on temperament. Some looked nervous. Others looked amused. A few looked like they were calculating the distance to the nearest loaf of bread. But beneath all that was a hum of sincerity. Because this moment, however humble, mattered. The vows were short. There were no monologues. No rehearsed poetry. Just a few essential promises. In many villages, the bride and groom would repeat lines spoken by the priest. I take you, in sickness and health, in warmth and famine, to share my roof, my bread, and my name. Or some version of that, depending on who was speaking and how much ale had already been consumed. The exchange of a token, most often a ring, was not guaranteed. Metal was scarce. Jewelry scarcer still. If a ring was present, it might have been passed down through generations, each dint a reminder of an ancestor who also stood in the same patch of dirt, making the same promises. If there was no ring, a woven cord or shared piece of cloth served the same purpose. Sometimes, a coin was pressed from one hand to another, or a kiss was shared in silence. That kiss was not mandatory, but when it happened, it carried the weight of ceremony. The priest would speak a blessing, invoking saints, seasons, and soil. He might wave a hand, draw a cross in the air, or place a palm on each forehead. If the weather was merciful, he took his time. If thunder loomed, he accelerated with admirable speed. Either way, the union was declared. You are bound, he would say. Before this village and before God. And then came the interruptions. Someone would sneeze. A goat would bleat. A child would shout something deeply inappropriate. The priest would pause, squint, and decide whether to continue or address the chaos. Usually, he continued. Interruptions were not disrespectful. They were expected. Life happened. A sacred vow was no less sacred because it was drowned out by a rooster. In fact, these interruptions made the moment more real. A wedding unaccompanied by clucks, coughs, and the occasional shriek from the stew pot was suspect. It meant no one had truly lived in it. The chaos was not a flaw. It was proof. After the official words, there was a brief silence, the only moment in the day when everything paused. Not long. Just enough time for the couple to look at each other, or at the crowd, or at the spot where someone had dropped a carrot. In that pause, the village held its collective breath. This was it. And then came the cheer. It was not a refined applause. It was a roar. A noise that combined relief, joy, and the urgent desire to begin feasting. Children clapped with sticky hands. Elders nodded with misty eyes. Someone threw a flower. Someone else threw a spoon. Someone shouted, "Finally!" with the enthusiasm of a man who had bet on the bride. And just like that, the ceremony was over. There was no organ music, no recessional march. Just people moving forward, arms outstretched, offering congratulations in the form of pats, jokes, and slightly over-enthusiastic hugs. The priest might slip away quietly or stay for a drink, depending on whether he had already blessed the next village's cider. The couple did not walk down an aisle. They were simply absorbed into the crowd. One moment, they were the center. The next, they were part of the whole. The transition was seamless. It was symbolic, too, from individuals making a promise, to a household among households, folded into the fabric of the village. In the end, the ceremony's brevity did not diminish its weight. In a world where lives were short, winters long, and joys fleeting, to stand before others and say, "I choose you," was a radical act. It did not need marble floors or golden rings. It needed witnesses. It needed honesty. It needed two people willing to speak when silence would be easier. And so, with words brief and holy, interrupted by birds, babies, and a persistent breeze, the couple was married. Not in a cathedral. Not in a book. But in the eyes of the village, in the gaze of the livestock, and in the endless turning of the seasons around them. That was enough. That was everything. The moment the final blessing hung in the air, just after the priest muttered his last sacred words and just before someone's pig tripped over the ceremonial jug, the ceremony ended and something entirely different began. The wedding was not over. It had only shed its holy skin and slipped into something more chaotic. The couple, only seconds into their marriage, were immediately engulfed. Villagers swarmed them like bees on a cider barrel. There were cheers, claps, whistles, and an astonishing number of backslaps. Some offered congratulations with sincerity, others with the boisterous energy of people who had been waiting all morning for this moment to descend into revelry. The newlyweds barely had time to exchange a glance before they were pulled in 10 different directions. The bride was kissed on both cheeks by women she did not recognize and given gifts she could not carry. Herbs, bread ends, tokens of goodwill, and in one case, a chicken who had already laid an egg mid-ceremony. The groom was offered a flask, a firm handshake, and a deeply emotional story from a man who claimed to have known his grandfather's goat. Children took this shift in tone as a signal to erupt. They ran through the crowd screaming with glee, chasing dogs and each other. Someone started a game that involved a stick, 3 potatoes, and absolutely no rules. Within moments, 2 small children were covered in mud and shouting triumphantly about having won the wedding. Meanwhile, the crowd ballooned. People arrived late and acted as if they had not missed anything. Strangers blended in. An old woman began retelling the vows in her own version, complete with dramatic reenactments and incorrect names. It did not matter. The details were already bending under the weight of celebration. Ale began to flow. Not gracefully. Not in moderation. Buckets were passed, jugs tilted, cups spilled and refilled with the rhythm of people who had waited too long to celebrate something. Anything. A wedding was joy sanctioned by ritual. It gave people permission to forget their aches, their debts, their grievances with the butcher. Soon, someone produced a fiddle. No one knew where it had come from. Fiddles were like that. They emerged from cloaks or shadows or inherited chaos. The player tuned it briefly, then launched into a tune that had no name and possibly no end. Feet began to stomp, not in unison but in solidarity. It was less a dance and more a collective thrashing to the rhythm of happiness. The bride and groom were lifted briefly by the crowd, not high, just enough to rattle them. It was a tradition in some villages to elevate the couple above ground, if only for a breath, to symbolize their transformation. Then, just as quickly, they were set down and handed cups, slices of something vaguely edible, and told to eat quickly before the pigs got in again. Goats wandered freely through the throng, some adorned with garlands, others nibbling them. One goat, decorated with a ribbon and a suspicious gleam in its eye, became the unofficial emblem of the celebration. Children tried to ride it. Adults cheered them on until one fell off and declared the goat cursed, which only made it more popular. Food appeared as if summoned by joy. Baskets of bread, pots of stew, roasted root vegetables, wheels of cheese too hard to slice but easy to throw. Plates were optional. Fingers did the work. Napkins did not exist, so sleeves and aprons bore the evidence. Someone roasted something that might have once been a duck, or possibly a large pigeon. No one asked? Everyone ate. Stories flowed just as freely. Tales of other weddings, of love found in haylofts and fights started over bread. Elders recounted their own unions, exaggerating for entertainment. One man swore his bride had challenged him to a wrestling match before agreeing to marry. The story changed every time he told it, growing more romantic and more physically implausible with each retelling. Not all chaos was cheerful. Arguments flared, old feuds reignited under the influence of ale and loud music. 2 cousins debated which family had provided the better dowry until they were shushed by a child who declared them both boring. A near duel was narrowly avoided when someone offered both parties more stew. In this village, food was both weapon and peace offering. Through it all, the couple remained at the center, spinning slowly in the eye of the storm. They were congratulated, interrogated, and occasionally forgotten. Sometimes they found each other's hands. Other times they stood 10 feet apart, both being fed different types of pie by different relatives. And somehow, in all the frenzy, they shared a look, that quiet, astonished gaze that said, "We did it! This is ours!" Night crept in unnoticed. Torches were lit. Fires crackled. The dancing grew wilder, the laughter louder. The goats were herded, reluctantly, toward the edge of the gathering, though one remained, now wearing a child's bonnet. Songs shifted from joyous to nostalgic. Someone sang a ballad about lost love that ended with a snort of laughter and an out-of-tune chorus. And just before the stars fully claimed the sky, the noise softened. People drifted into groups. The stewpots emptied. Children fell asleep where they stood. The bride sat beside the groom, their shoulders touching, their faces streaked with sweat and soot and joy. They were no longer two people about to marry. They were a unit, a story, a new branch of the sprawling, messy tree that was their village. In the calm that followed the roar, the couple leaned into each other. No speeches were given. No fireworks were lit. But in that moment, with the wind carrying the last notes of a fiddle and a goat snoring softly nearby, everything felt perfectly, gloriously whole. The vows had been spoken. The people had witnessed. The chaos had claimed its part. And now, the wedding had truly begun. If the ceremony was the soul of a medieval wedding, the feast was its body, earthy, loud, overstuffed, and slightly singed. While the vows were sacred and solemn, the meal that followed was a glorious riot of appetite, tradition, and community survival instincts. No one came to a wedding just for the blessings. They came for the stew. There was no banquet hall. No rows of polished silver or crystal goblets. The feast happened wherever the people were. That could mean the center of the village, under the churchyard tree, beside the field, or wherever someone had set up enough flat stones and overturned barrels to act as makeshift tables. People sat on logs, crates, or the ground. If you were lucky, you got half a stool. If you were wise, you stood near the stew. Preparation for the feast began days before the actual wedding, though preparation might be too strong a word. It was more of an unfolding. Each household contributed what it could: root vegetables, dried herbs, stale bread, a questionable cut of meat, or, in rare cases, a whole animal. No single family could feed the village. But the village, as a whole, could feed itself. The feast was a potluck of survival. The centerpiece of the meal was almost always a stew. Not one stew, but several, each bubbling in enormous blackened pots over open fires. Recipes were never written down, passed instead through muscle memory and instinct. You started with onions if you had them. Added cabbage, always. Carrots if they had survived the season. Barley when luck permitted. Meat was the crown jewel. But whether it came from a pig, a chicken, a hare, or something nobody asked about depended on circumstance. It simmered for hours, sometimes days. And it could feed dozens. Alongside the stew, there was bread. Not soft loaves with golden crusts, but dense, flat slabs with the texture of ambition and a taste that hinted at flour, smoke, and old oven stones. These loaves were broken with fingers, used to soak up broth, or flung like celebratory missiles when the ale ran particularly strong. And then, of course, the cheese. Every village had its cheesemaker, and every cheesemaker took weddings as an opportunity to display their craft. Wheels of cheese appeared, some hard, some soft, some fragrant in ways that defied language. Guests debated which was best, which was cursed, and which had lived in someone's rafters too long. Sweets were rare, but treasured. Honey nuts, dried fruits, and simple pastries made appearances if bees had been kind that year and if no one had eaten the sugar stores during winter. Someone might bring a pie, though what it was filled with was a mystery that varied from slice to slice. There was no cake. Cake belonged to castles and books. The village had stewed apples and the occasional roasted beets sweetened with syrup. Ale was the glue. Brewed in barrels and stored in dark corners of cool huts, it flowed freely during weddings. Not because it was in abundance, but because it was joy's companion. Cups were shared, refilled, and sometimes lost to goats. Cider joined the ale if the apples had cooperated. Water was also served, begrudgingly, to children and those recovering from last night's pre-wedding drinking. People ate with their hands. Knives were used, but rarely needed. Food was shared by proximity. Whoever was sitting nearest the pot became an honorary server. Napkins did not exist. Fingers were wiped on cloaks, sleeves, or the grass. Plates were wooden, if used at all. Often, food was passed in hollowed-out bread or cradled in leaves. One clever woman once carved bowls from turnips. She was revered. As the eating began, so too did the storytelling. Stories and food had always walked hand in hand. The feast was a theater of memory. Elders told tales of past weddings, of old feasts where the stew had burned or the ale had fermented too well. Children exaggerated their own brief lives, claiming heroic cabbage-washing escapades. Travelers told of distant lands where people dined on fish from the sea or bread as soft as clouds. Most did not believe them. Everyone listened anyway. Singing emerged without prompt. Someone started a verse, off-key, half-remembered, and others joined, their voices rising and falling like the flames licking at the stew pots. The songs were about love, loss, chickens, and heroic deeds both real and imagined. Some songs were only sung at weddings, reserved for these exact moments of shared fullness and slurred joy. There were rituals, too. Superstitions woven into the meal like herbs in the broth. A bone placed beside the door for luck. A spoon passed from bride to groom and back again. A toast made with the first ladleful, offered to the oldest guest present. Each act meant something, though what exactly varied by who you asked? Meaning was less about certainty and more about repetition. Arguments surfaced, as they always did when bellies were full and ale was flowing. Someone would accuse someone else of hoarding carrots. A man would insist he had been promised a larger portion of meat because he once lent the groom a bucket. These spats flared and faded like sparks. They were part of the show. Rarely serious. Often solved with more stew. The bride and groom were pulled in every direction. Fed by eager hands. Toasted by strangers. Whispered to by relatives with urgent marital advice. They barely sat. They did not need to. Their feast was not about eating, but about being feasted, welcomed, celebrated, consumed by affection and attention until they were full not of food, but of belonging. As the sky darkened and the pots emptied, the village leaned back with the satisfaction of a job well done. Plates were licked clean or tossed to the dogs. Children slept under benches. Elders leaned on each other, murmuring that this was a good wedding, one to remember, one to compare all future weddings against. There had been no cake. But there had been bread, stew, ale, song, and a goat who tried to steal the cheese. And really, that was more than enough. In a medieval wedding, gifts were less about sentiment and more about survival. There were no registries, no coordinated themes, no whispered worries about duplicate toasters. What you brought to a wedding was based not on convenience, but on need, the couple's need to start a life, and your need to not show up empty-handed in front of your neighbors. The first rule of wedding gifting: make it useful. Romance was saved for songs and sidelong glances, but the gifts themselves had to earn their keep. A woven basket, a bundle of kindling, a clay jug that no longer leaked, these were offerings that spoke volumes. May your water stay inside your vessel, was the peasant equivalent of, may your love last forever. Most gifts came wrapped in nothing at all. Presentation mattered little. An armful of firewood, a slightly bruised apple, or a fat root vegetable was handed over bare, with a nod. If you wrapped something, it was probably in a bit of cloth you expected to get back. It was understood. A gift was a transaction of goodwill, not performance. Many gifts were edible. Dried herbs tied with twine, a round of hard cheese, a string of onions, or, if one truly aimed to impress, a pie. Not a pie in a box, but one carried gingerly in a shawl, still warm from a smoky hearth, filled with mysterious goodness. Guests would lean in and sniff, trying to identify ingredients. Is that plum? Or pigeon? Both. The giver might beam. Animals were high-value presents. A chicken was generous. A goose extravagant. A goat, while occasionally inconvenient, was a declaration of esteem. But animals came with conditions, mostly implied. If you gave a hen, you were expected to pretend not to notice if its first egg came back your way. And if you gifted a rooster, you had to accept that someone would curse you every morning at dawn for the foreseeable future. Tools were common gifts, too. Not gleaming new ones, few had those, but trusted, worn ones. A well-loved hoe. a wooden spoon polished by generations of soup, a hammer with a personality and a splintered handle. These gifts were not flashy, but they mattered. A couple could face a rough winter with less fear if they had the right blade, the right pot, the right kindling pile. Textiles were a favorite among the older women. Scarves, aprons, patched blankets, even a length of rough-spun wool that could someday become something useful. These gifts bore the scent of smoke and lavender, stitched with care, or at least urgency. A quilt, if it appeared, was met with reverent silence, both because of its rarity and because no one wanted to admit they had once used it as a curtain. Less tangible gifts were also exchanged. Promises to help with the harvest. Offers to mend thatch in spring. Agreements to trade bread for eggs for the next 6 months. These were not written contracts, but they were remembered. A wedding was not only a bond between two people, but a quiet web of mutual obligation spun across the village. Occasionally, a gift was clearly regifted. A strangely shaped ladle. A ceramic jug with initials carved by a hand long since gone. No one said anything. Regifting was not frowned upon. It was tradition. Objects carried stories, and passing them on was a form of folklore. You were not just giving a thing. You were giving a tale, a lineage, a laugh. There were jokes, too. Someone might bring a gift that was clearly a prank, a log with a smile painted on it, a boot filled with cabbage, a sheep with a note. She listens better than most wives. These were delivered with a wink and a hearty laugh. The couple was expected to laugh too, and usually did, because to be roasted by the village meant you were loved. Sometimes the couple gave gifts as well, symbolic tokens to guests, especially elders or midwives who had played roles in their lives. A shared loaf. A carved bead. A small blessing muttered into someone's palm. These gifts reversed the current, a way of saying, "We may be starting fresh, but we have not forgotten who helped us get here." Children brought what they could. A painted rock. A feather they were convinced was magical. A drawing scratched into bark. These were received with the same seriousness as a gifted hen. The bride would smile. The groom would nod solemnly. And the child would float away, proud beyond measure. Not all gifts lasted. Some were eaten by dogs before the end of the feast. Some were broken in the merriment. One famously gifted goat escaped mid-dance and was not seen for 3 days. But that was not the point. Gifts were not about permanence. They were about gesture, about taking part, contributing to the patchwork that would become the couple's new life. As the evening wore on and guests prepared to stumble home, the gifts lay in a humble pile: jugs and spoons, herbs and twine, a cabbage shaped like a heart, a blanket still warm from the giver's arms. The couple would look at them later, perhaps with confusion, perhaps with awe, and begin sorting what was useful from what was simply odd. But they would keep it all. Because in that pile of mismatched offerings, in the goat with the tilted head, the cracked bowl, the note written in ash on a scrap of bark, lived the village's way of saying, without a single flower or card, "We are with you." And in a world stitched together by hands, not machines, and warmed by fire, not wires, that kind of gift was worth more than gold. Every medieval wedding had its own flavor, shaped not just by the food or the vows, but by the cast of characters that assembled to witness, bless, interrupt, and embellish the occasion. These were not guests in the modern sense. They were villagers, kinfolk, tagalongs, and livestock owners, each arriving with a backstory, a purpose, and an opinion. If the feast was the body and the vows were the heart, then the people were the spirit. And what a spirited bunch they were. First, there was the loud uncle. Every village had one. Often shirtless by dusk, always holding something fermented, and speaking in a voice that carried across valleys. He had opinions on everything: the bride's dress, the groom's handshake, the quality of the cheese. His stories were endless, most of them suspect. "Did I ever tell you about the time I outran a storm to propose to a woman who turned out to be a bishop's niece?" He would begin, again. Then came the whispering widows. They traveled in trios or quartets, like a murmuring flock of crows in shawls. They judged from the sidelines, one eye on the bride, one eye on each other. Their commentary was low but potent. "That tunic is the wrong shade of blue. Her mother wore green, much better. And did you see who brought pickled eggs? As if that is a wedding gift." There was always a storyteller. Not the priest, not the groom, but someone with a flair for drama and a belly full of poetry. He would retell the ceremony to latecomers as if it had been a royal affair, each goat more majestic, each sigh more poetic. Children gathered at his feet. Adults rolled their eyes but leaned in anyway. His words were windows. A gaggle of children swarmed every corner. Their laughter was like birdsong, chaotic but cheerful. One would inevitably steal a chicken feather and declare it a magic quill. Another would try to somersault near the stew fire. They wore crooked garlands and mismatched boots, their presence both delight and hazard. Somewhere near the middle of the celebration stood the silent giant, not necessarily tall, but stoic. A blacksmith, perhaps, or a widow's son. He did not say much, but when he lifted the barrel or caught the tumbling toddler, the village noticed. His strength was quiet, his purpose unsaid. He was the one you trusted to carry the stew or stop a fist fight. There was the flirt. Male or female, they fluttered between groups, laughing too loudly, offering ale and sly remarks. Their presence was a balm or a blight depending on the recipient. Their charm, while occasionally exhausting, reminded everyone that weddings were fertile ground for other promises, for glances that lingered and futures unspoken. At every table, a sleepy elder held court. Usually half asleep, entirely toothless, and prone to waking mid-snore to contribute a single sentence of staggering wisdom. "Love is bread with salt," one might mutter before nodding off again. No one argued. Elders spoke in riddles, and riddles ruled the heart. The couple themselves, even in the chaos, became characters. The groom, overwhelmed and smiling in fits, tried to make eye contact with everyone and spilled cider twice. The bride, radiant not because of her dress but because of her place, central, celebrated, seen, beamed and blushed and quietly held the universe together with glances and laughter. There was always an animal that seemed more involved than it should be. A goat that followed the bride like a bodyguard. A chicken that leapt into someone's lap at just the wrong moment. A dog that sat beside the storyteller, as if it understood every word. These creatures were not just tolerated, they were legends in the making. In the shadows of the festivities lingered the loners. The ones who did not quite belong, or who preferred watching to participating. Maybe a traveler. Maybe a cousin from the far fields. They stood near the edge, hands in pockets, eyes observant. They carried stories not yet told. They reminded the village that some tales take longer to join. The village fool made an appearance, of course. Not a professional jester, but someone who stumbled through joy with such clumsy enthusiasm that people could not help but laugh. He danced with goats, tripped over hay, spilled soup on himself, and declared it intentional. His antics reset tension. He made silliness sacred. And then there were the helpers, the quiet heroes. The woman who noticed when the bride needed water. The man who chased off the pigs before they reached the stew. The teenager who replaced a knocked-over bench without being asked. They moved like breath, invisible until they were missed. The wedding owed much to them. Every character, from the boastful to the bashful, added a thread to the wedding's tapestry. Without the widow's gossip, there would be no humor. Without the child's shriek, no joy. Without the flirt, no mystery. Without the elder's sigh, no weight. It was these people, flawed, loud, quiet, kind, who turned a ritual into a memory. And in the years to come, when someone spoke of that wedding, of the vows, the stew, the dancing, they would always mention the people. Remember the uncle who sang with the fiddle? Remember the goat who stole a scarf? Remember how the bride's laugh sounded like spring? Because in the end, the characters were the story. The vows were words. The food would fade. But the people? They lived on in laughter, in legends, in the slow retelling of a wedding that had once, just once, made everyone feel like they belonged. No medieval wedding was complete without the delightful, dangerous, and utterly untamable chaos that was the children. They came in swarms, barefoot, grass-stained, and sticky-fingered, like bees released from a barrel. No one invited them. No one had to. They followed the scent of bread, the promise of distraction, and the faint hope that someone would drop a meat pie. They were never dressed for the occasion, unless by sheer accident. A crooked flower crown, a cloak 3 sizes too large, a boot on one foot and a sandal on the other, these were their uniforms. Clothes were chosen not for style but for speed. Could you climb in them? Could you slide down a haystack without losing your tunic? If yes, they were perfect. From the moment the village began to gather, the children activated like wine through dry leaves. They darted between legs, crawled under tables, scaled fences and trees with alarming agility. The adults barely noticed. Unless a scream pierced the sky or a barrel tipped, children were left to their own governance. And their laws were simple: run faster than the trouble you caused. Games emerged from thin air. One moment, 3 boys were poking a beetle with a stick. The next, 12 children were locked in a high-stakes competition involving sticks, mud, and rules that changed every 10 seconds. A girl with twine in her hair declared herself queen of the straw pile. 2 boys fought over a worm and called it jousting. It was diplomacy at its wildest. The flower wars were inevitable. Armed with bundles of dandelions and fists full of petals, children staged battles as guests looked on with fond exasperation. No flower crown survived intact. No patch of grass remained untrampled. Someone always emerged crying. Someone always emerged covered in glory. Usually, it was the same person. Food was both battlefield and prize. Children had a sixth sense for when the bread would be cut, when the stew was unattended, when someone dropped a plum. They lingered near food like small wolves, waiting for weakness. A distracted adult was a buffet invitation. Crumbs were currency. One cunning child traded an onion ring for a bite of apple tart, then stole the onion ring back. Haystacks were the main attraction. At least one was commandeered as the unofficial kingdom of childhood. They climbed it. They jumped off it. They burrowed inside it like nesting animals. By the end of the evening, half the stack was flat and the other half contained 3 sleeping cousins and a cat. Injuries happened. Scraped knees. Splinters. A surprising number of mild head bumps. But none of them cried for long. Not because it did not hurt, but because there was too much still to do. Tears were wiped on sleeves, dirt was slapped over wounds, and off they went, heroes of their own muddy epics. The smaller ones followed the bigger ones in a kind of chaotic pilgrimage. Toddlers mimicked dances, tripped over their own feet, and laughed with open mouths full of bread. Babies were passed from lap to lap, kissed by everyone, ignored by no one. A wedding was one of the few times a mother could eat with 2 hands, provided she kept one eye on the goat. Occasionally, a child would interrupt something important. A vow. A blessing. A particularly heartfelt toast. No one minded. The interruptions were part of the rhythm. A high-pitched, "Look what I found!" followed by a worm waved like a victory flag might draw more applause than the groom's speech. That was just how it was. The children were not just background noise. They were integral. They brought motion, mischief, and a kind of joy that adults had long forgotten how to summon. Their play echoed the older world: mock weddings, pretend sword fights, stolen kisses behind bushes. They mimicked their future with reckless, glorious energy. Some of them would remember the wedding. Others would not. But they would remember the feeling, the freedom, the feast, the way the sky looked when you were lying in a field with a belly full of stolen cheese. Weddings were less about witnessing love, more about experiencing life. And the children lived it the loudest. When the night grew deep and the firelight softened, the children began to quiet. One by one, they curled into corners, into laps, into blankets laid near the fire. A boy fell asleep with a piece of bread in his mouth. A girl snored into a goat's flank. The haystack kingdom turned into a dormitory. Tiny feet dangled from benches. Tiny snores joined the music. No one called them home. Home was the wedding now. Home was the shared space, the laughter, the stew-stained hands. Parents retrieved them gently, wrapped them in cloaks, carried them across the moonlit field with hearts made heavier and lighter all at once. Childhood passed quickly in the medieval world. But nights like these slowed it down just enough. And in the years ahead, when these children became brides and grooms themselves, when they stood in the same field or churchyard, they would remember. Maybe not the details, but the wildness, the warmth, the feeling of belonging so complete it did not need to be explained. The children were feral, yes, but they were the future. And on wedding days, the village let them be wild, not in spite of love, but in honor of it. Music, in a medieval wedding, was not a luxury. It was a necessity, as vital as stew, as natural as laughter, and often just as off-key. It did not matter if there were trained musicians, rare, rehearsed performances, rarer, or even instruments that had not been partially chewed by goats, rarest of all. What mattered was sound, joyful, wild, pulsing sound, echoing off the hills and barns and tilted chapel stones. The music began in fragments. A whistle here. A rhythm beaten on a wooden bench there. Someone humming the start of a drinking song as they poured ale with dramatic flair. And then, as if pulled by invisible strings, instruments emerged from cloaks, satchels, and somewhere under the brewer's cart. The fiddle was king. Not a polished, tuned, or particularly reliable fiddle, but one whose strings still vibrated and whose player could stomp his foot in time. The fiddler always arrived late, with an apologetic shrug and eyes red from either smoke or spirits. He needed no warm-up. He would tune his strings with one ear to the crowd, then launch into a reel that sent dust flying and feet moving. Other instruments joined in, some real, some questionably invented. A hollow gourd that doubled as a drum. Spoons clicked together with surprising precision. A flute whittled from riverwood, held together with wax and hope. Even a comb wrapped in parchment could become a buzzing accompaniment. There were no rehearsals. Only rhythm. The music was never perfect. It wobbled. It faltered. It paused when someone sneezed too close to the flute. But no one cared. The joy was not in precision, it was in participation. A missed note was just another beat in the symphony of mayhem. Dancing followed music like thunder follows lightning. It erupted. It did not begin with a formal partner call or a nod from the host. It began when one person could not sit still anymore and another was brave enough to follow. Then 10 more joined. Then 20. And suddenly the village was moving like a single, mismatched body, limbs flying, boots thudding, skirts spinning. There were no steps. No names for the dances. Just circles, stomps, spins, and the occasional leap of questionable safety. Arms were grabbed, hands clapped, backs patted hard enough to knock the rhythm loose. Children spun until they fell. Elders swayed with dignity. Young lovers used it as an excuse to hold each other longer than was strictly polite. The bride danced first with her groom, then with her father, then with her best friend, then with the blacksmith who declared he was a better dancer than husband material. The groom danced until his knees gave out, then sang while others danced around him. It was a communal performance, a celebration of shared breath, shared blood, and the blessed ability to move. Mistakes were the best part. Someone always slipped. Someone always collided with a barrel. Someone lifted a partner too enthusiastically and ended up flat in the grass. Laughter followed every misstep. Mayhem was not a side effect, it was the goal. Songs rotated. Some were loud and bawdy, filled with innuendo and belly laughter. Others were haunting, minor-key ballads of love lost in battle or fields of flowers kissed by ghosts. The tempo rose and fell like a tide. When the music slowed, people caught their breath. When it soared again, they leapt up like resurrected saints. There were traditions, too. Dances that must be done, songs that must be sung. A circle where everyone had to take a turn in the center, showing off a move, even if that move was just shrugging and spinning like a confused duck. The oldest man would be pulled in, groaning, then grin and outstomp the teenagers. The priest, if still present and upright, would be dragged into a dance that ended with spilled cider and communal applause. Even those who did not dance joined in. They clapped. They sang. They stomped their feet from benches. They cheered for every twirl, every tumble, every drunken dip. Music belonged to everyone. It was not a performance. It was possession. And amid the music and movement, moments crystallized. A child asleep in someone's lap, lulled by the drone of a flute. A mother twirling with her son, both laughing like they had just invented happiness. 2 elders swaying slowly in the shadow of the bonfire, their hands so used to holding each other that no rhythm was needed. Sometimes, the music stopped, not by design, but because a string broke, or a drum cracked, or the flute player sneezed into his instrument and had to go lie down. A hush would fall. Someone would cough. Then someone else would start to hum. And before long, it began again. The bonfire was the heart of the mayhem. It flickered, roared, warmed the fiddler fingers and dried the sleeves of dancers who had tumbled into puddles. Sparks flew up like notes into the sky. Around it, people danced until the soles of their feet went numb, and the edges of their vision turned soft with joy. And when, finally, the music slowed for good, when even the fiddler slumped and declared his strings cursed and his fingers blessed, the dancing stilled. People sat or collapsed or leaned against barrels. But no one left. Not yet. Not until the last note faded, the last cheer echoed, and the fire flickered low. Because music, like love, did not need to be perfect. It just needed to be shared. And in that field, on that night, with fiddles creaking and hearts pounding, the mayhem was music, and the music was home. Dancing at a medieval wedding was less of an activity and more of a natural disaster, inevitable, uncontrolled, and completely unforgettable. It did not matter if you had rhythm. It did not matter if your left foot pointed vaguely toward the east while your right tried to escape. If there was music, you danced. And if there was not music, you danced anyway, because your cousin had started humming and someone else was already clapping. It began with feet. First one, then another, stomping in hesitant time. Then a hand clapped. Then two. Then suddenly the crowd was pulsing like a great, muddy, joyful beast. There were no choreographers, only chaos. A child would spin, and a grandfather would join. A widow with a cane would lift her skirts and stomp so hard the dust took notice. And off it went. Some danced like they were in love. Others danced like they were on fire. A few might actually have been, such was the proximity of torches, ale, and flammable sleeves. But no one stopped. This was not elegant, courtly movement. This was defiance. This was celebration shouted through limbs. They danced in circles, because lines were for armies and weddings were not battles, except when the stew ran out. Arms flung wide. Feet stomped like they were trying to wake ancestors. A man did a leap so enthusiastic he landed in the breadbasket. He was cheered as a hero. The fire in the center flickered, casting long shadows that danced with them. Sparks leapt like wild applause. People circled it, not in ritual, but in relief. The fire held back the dark. It reminded them that joy was possible even in the face of long winters and short bread. The bride and groom were lifted again, not on chairs, chairs were too valuable, but on shoulders. They laughed like they had been reborn. Their fingers tangled. Their heads leaned close. They were not above the crowd. They were inside it, part of it, radiant in its glow. Around them, the village spun. People invented steps. Some stomped in one place. Some ran in loops. A dog joined in, tail wagging, tripping 3 people and being applauded for it. A chicken escaped and ran between dancers. No one paused. There was a tradition, old as hills, where one guest, usually the one with the reddest cheeks and the loudest voice, had to invent a dance on the spot. They would declare its name. The turnip, or the spilled ale, or the bride's brother's lament. And everyone had to imitate it. Poorly. It was tradition. The only rule was not to stop. You danced until your legs gave out, or someone handed you a mug of something strong enough to make you forget your own name. Then you rested. Then you danced again. Elders tapped their canes. Children tried to spin faster than they could stand. Someone shouted, "This is the best wedding in 7 winters!" and fell over, still clapping. The ground bore the memory. Grass became mud. Mud became rhythm. Boots left prints like musical notes. Someone started drumming on an overturned barrel. Someone else joined with a spoon and a jug. And just like that, a new song was born, played only once, remembered forever. And always, someone was singing. Loud, off-key, unstoppable. Love songs. Work songs. Nonsense songs. A chant made entirely of animal noises. It did not matter. The words were not important. The sound was. It filled the air like heat. Like breath. Like hope. Dancing through the night was not about impressing anyone. It was not about skill. It was about showing up with your whole body. About saying, with movement, "I am alive. I am here. And I do not care if I fall." And sometimes people did fall. Into arms. Into grass. Into love. A pair of eyes would meet across the firelight. A smile would last too long. A hand would brush another, and suddenly, there was something new, something just beginning, even as the wedding neared its end. As the night deepened, the movement slowed. Not for lack of spirit, but for lack of knees. People began to sway more than step. Heads rested on shoulders. Children slept on hay. The music softened. The fire whispered instead of shouted. And finally, someone sang a final verse. A song old enough to belong to no one. It was about longing. About belonging. About how love is just dancing through life with someone who does not mind if you step on their feet. No one clapped at the end. They just stood there, quiet, wrapped in each other, in wool, in warmth. And then slowly, without plan or command, they began to drift away. Back to huts. To beds. To dreams. Because even fire must sleep. Even dancers must rest. But in the silence, their footsteps still echoed. On worn earth. In tired hearts. In the kind of joy that lives forever in the bones. And somewhere, under the stars, the music still played. By the time the wedding night arrived, the village had already written its version of it. The couple had not yet crossed the threshold, but the stories had. Whispers had taken root before the vows were even spoken, and by the time the fire burned low and the dancing gave way to yawns, the entire village was abuzz with speculation. What would happen? Would the heavens crack open? Would goats faint from the passion? The truth, of course, was far less theatrical. The wedding night was not always the stuff of legend. It was the culmination of a long, loud, muddy day. The bride and groom were not walking into a tapestry of petals and silk. They were staggering toward a small, smoky room, in clothes that smelled like stew, with limbs that had danced, carried, lifted, and hugged 100 people. Their bodies ached. Their heads were full. Their stomachs, hopefully, were satisfied. The only thing truly on fire was their feet. There was no ceremonial escort, no petal-strewn path, no hour-long serenade. If there was any fanfare, it was unintentional, a chorus of drunks singing off-key as the couple slipped away. Sometimes a cousin shouted something crude. Sometimes someone tossed herbs after them for fertility. But mostly, the couple just disappeared. They escaped into shadows, hoping that the noise would die down enough to let them speak to each other without shouting. The bed, if one could call it that, was humble. A wooden frame. A straw mattress. A wool blanket that had seen too many winters. If the family was lucky, the couple had a private room. If not, a curtain hung in the corner of a shared space. Privacy was a concept, not a guarantee. Even in the most generous arrangements, the thin walls did little to muffle sound, not that anyone minded. Noise was often encouraged. For the villagers, the wedding night was a community event, in theory, if not in attendance. The consummation of the marriage was important. It was a sacred act, a legal necessity, a rite of passage. It meant the marriage was real. It meant the future could begin. And so the village watched, waited, and then retreated, to stew their own stories, to sip ale and compare notes, to weave tales around a truth they would never see. Among the elders and gossips, tales bloomed like mushrooms in damp thatch. She screamed so loud the owl flew off. He fainted before he touched her. They knocked the whole bed into the fire. These stories were not meant to be believed. They were meant to be told. To entertain. To hint at mystery. The real wedding night, however, was far more human. Some couples fell into each other like kindling. Years of longing released in a kiss. Nervous fingers, whispered jokes, and the wonder of closeness. Others lay side by side, too exhausted to move, their hands touching lightly under the covers, their eyes wide with the realization that everything had changed. And still, some lay in silence, unsure of what to say next now that the music had faded and the village had fallen quiet. There were fears. For many it was their first time. For others it was their first time with this person, this promise. The body can be an intimidating country, and exploration takes time. There was no guidebook. Only instinct. Only breath. And the awkward, beautiful truth of two people learning each other. The straw mattress creaked. The blanket slipped. A dog barked outside. Somewhere, a neighbor coughed. Romance lived in the cracks, not the perfection. There was laughter, embarrassment, apologies, and surprises. There was joy, often small and trembling, like a flame protected by cupped hands. Not every wedding night was bliss. Some began with nerves and ended with sleep. Some were tender. Others were clumsy. A few were strained, shaped by the weight of expectation or old fears. But even those moments mattered. They were the beginning of something. Not a performance, but a process. A promise spoken not just in words, but in presence. In some traditions, proof was required, a blood-stained cloth, a token of the bride's virginity. This practice was cruel, invasive, and deeply rooted in control. Some villages followed it. Others did not. But even in places where no cloth was waved, the pressure remained, silent, heavy, hovering over the marriage bed like a judgmental ant. Still, many couples found their way past it. They carved out a space, however small, where the world fell away and only their breath remained. Where hands held, not out of duty, but curiosity. Where laughter healed awkward silences. Where love, or the possibility of it, began to bloom. The room did not need candles or rose petals. It needed trust. It needed patience. In those first quiet hours, some spoke of the future. Of what they would build, what they would plant, what kind of people they hoped to become. Others said nothing, letting the comfort of shared breath do the speaking. A body pressed against another in peace can say more than 1,000 words. And in the morning they emerged. Not as transformed lovers, not glowing with myth. Just two people, sleep-mussed and slightly sore, blinking at the sun. They joined the rest of the village, accepted the congratulations, the smirks, the questions. They ate breakfast like everyone else. They helped clean the stew pots. They held hands when no one was looking. They did not need to speak of the night. It was theirs alone. And while the village recounted stories of passion and wild ecstasy, the couple held on to something quieter, something more real. A glance. A shared breath. A memory of nervous fingers finding courage. A whispered joke. A slow smile. The kind of beginning that does not roar, but hums softly under the skin. The wedding night was not always magic, but it was theirs. And in a world where life was hard, and love was uncertain, that small truth was enough to anchor them. The rumors would fade. The stories would change. But in the end, the only tale that mattered was the one they would write, together, starting with a kiss in the dark, and the sound of a straw mattress beneath them. Weddings end. Even the loudest, longest, most cider-soaked nights must bow to morning. The fire becomes embers. The stew pot is scraped clean. The fiddler sleeps face down beside his shoes. And somewhere, beneath a patchwork blanket and a straw mattress still carrying the scent of herbs and heat, two people open their eyes to a new kind of day. The wedding was a moment. Marriage would be the rest. The village wakes slowly. A rooster crows, hoarse from competing with singing all night. Children stir under benches. Someone yawns loudly enough to wake a goat. The square is littered with petals, crusts, and the echoes of laughter. It looks like a battlefield. It feels like a blessing. The newlyweds rise, blinking into sunlight. There are no trumpets. No parades. Only mourning. The groom stretches. The bride rubs the sleep from her eyes. They speak quietly, or not at all. They are no longer the center of celebration. They are simply part of the village again, but something is different. Breakfast is humble. Porridge, if there is any left. Bread, crusty and cold. Maybe an egg, if the chickens are merciful. The couple eats like everyone else. They wash their hands in the same basin. They nod at the same elders. But every glance they share feels heavier, anchored. A small nod across a table means, I remember. I am still with you. The wedding is over. The tasks return. Water must be fetched. The animals must be fed. If it is summer, the fields call. If it is winter, the firewood must be split. Marriage is not the feast. It is the cleaning afterward, the tending of the hearth, the lifting of buckets side by side. It is the rhythm that begins where the music left off. There is no honeymoon. There is no escape. The world continues, urgent and unbothered. But in that continuation, something sacred persists. The couple now moves as one unit, even when apart. They are part of each other's math now, dividing labor, multiplying hope. The neighbors drop by. Not all at once, but over hours, days. A jar of honey. A comment about the stew. A knowing smile. Marriage is acknowledged not with grand speeches, but with small offerings: help fixing a fence, a borrowed shovel returned, a bundle of herbs left on a doorstep. Some days feel just like every other. Others feel strange, as if the world is trying on a new skin. The couple learns each other's silences, their habits, their strange preferences. He snores like a war drum. She sings while sweeping. He hates turnips. She loves storms. They argue. They laugh. They survive their first week, their first cold night, their first real disagreement. And the world does not end. The wedding dress is hung, or folded, or repurposed into rags. The borrowed boots are returned. The garlands dry out and crumble. The gifts are used or broken. The goat, if gifted, eats a neighbor's laundry and becomes legend. Life consumes ceremony. But the memory lingers. Not just for the couple, but for the village. Children still reenact the dancing. Elders still debate whether the stew was better than last year's. The story of the chicken that stole a bread loaf is retold at least a dozen times. These small retellings stitch the event into the fabric of the village. Time passes. Seasons change. The couple becomes ordinary, and in that ordinariness, extraordinary. They share a roof through storms. They share silence without discomfort. They plant things that might take years to grow. They whisper plans no one else hears. They become part of the landscape, as steady as the stone wall, as warm as the morning fire. Children might come. Or not. If they do, they will one day hear about a night of dancing, of stew, of how their parents held hands when they thought no one saw. And in hearing, they will understand that love is not thunder. It is not spectacle. It is something quieter, slower, deeper. Love is waking up and fetching water. It is remembering how someone likes their bread. It is sitting by the fire in silence that does not ask to be filled. The wedding was one day. Marriage is 1,000. And in that stretch of days, in the mundane, in the mess, in the years stitched together by habit and laughter, something sacred unfolds. Not loudly, not perfectly, but with the steady pulse of presence. And so, as the village returns to routine and the couple steps into forever, there is no grand finale. Just a quiet continuation. A life shared. Because in the end, weddings are stories. But marriage is the home where the story is kept. So now, as the smoke fades and the dancing stops, we leave behind the wedding feast, the laughter, the muddy footprints, the whispered vows beneath starlight. The bride and groom are asleep now, curled under a warm blanket, their dreams woven with the sounds of goats, fiddles, and promises. The village is still. The fire is low. And the world, for once, feels quietly whole. Thank you for being here, for stepping into the dust and delight of a medieval wedding. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your thoughts are wandering, let them drift. And if you would like to stay a little longer, the sound of the fire will keep you company. Because in the end, it is not the feast or the flowers that linger. It is the warmth. Good night.